From the Oregon State University's Extension Service, you are listening to In the Woods with the Forestry and Natural Resources Program. This podcast aims to share the voices of researchers, land managers, and members of the public interested in telling the story of how woodlands provide more than just trees, they provide interconnectedness that is essential to your daily life. Stick around to discover a new topic related to forests on each episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to In the Woods podcast, presented by the Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program at Oregon State University. I am your host, Jacob Putney, Assistant Professor of Practice and Extension Agent in the College of Forestry. This month's episode is going to cover forest health, including why it's important and how it can influence the growth and development of woodlands. Our guest today is my colleague, Dr. Dave Shaw. He is a biologist and forest health specialist with the Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and professor in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. He's also the director of the Swiss Needlecast Cooperative, a research cooperative focused on maintaining the health of managed Douglas fir. So Dave, would you like to give an introduction and tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the work that you do?
Sure. Again, my name's David Shaw. I'm a forest health specialist, so forest health is near and dear to my heart, of course. And I have a PhD from University of Washington. I got that way back in 1991. And I worked at field stations for around 15 years or so before coming to Oregon State University in 2005. And I I work here again, as you said, as director of the Swiss Needlecast Co-op. Swiss Needlecast is a foliage disease of Douglas fir, and it's been affecting productivity of Douglas fir in particular geographic areas of the west side of Oregon. And I work with a range of forest insects and diseases and abiotic factors which influence tree mortality and growth and productivity of our forests.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you joining us today, Dave. I've had the privilege of knowing you for a while now, back when I was a student and now as colleagues in the extension program. So I guess we'll kind of dive right into it. So when we say forest health, what does that mean, and what kind of things does that really include?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because I struggle with that a lot. Forest health, I think, is everything. I mean, everybody feels like they want a healthy forest, but when you really get down to defining what a healthy forest is, it can become kind of complicated. And I think it's really intertwined with people's values and what they value about forests. And so their values really drive what they feel like a healthy forest is. So, but a lot of the kind of things we hear about when we talk about what a healthy forest is, it's something that's resistant and resilient to insects, diseases, fire, drought, these kind of things. It's sustainable. It provides ecosystem values. It provides landowner values, timber in some cases, wildlife in others. And so it often is really in the eye of the beholder what a healthy forest really is. And it often gets complicated about, what I would consider like tree health versus forest health. So everybody can agree, whether a tree has a root disease or a canker or a dead top or some other factor that's causing it to be unhealthy. But when it comes to forest health, some of these kind of things are really, dead tops, cavities, rot, that kind of stuff is really important to wildlife. So depending on your objectives, the landowners, a healthy forest might be a young, vigorous, free to grow plantation with minimal mortality, minimal growth losses. Other people think a healthy forest is a beautiful old growth forest with large old trees and high biodiversity and these kind of things. And sometimes those conflict with each other. But to quote an old pathologist from back in the day, Paul Mannion, he used to say that a healthy forest has a healthy amount of disease. He was a forest pathologist. And in that sense, a healthy forest would have habitat for wildlife, but it's also going to provide ecosystem values that the landowner would want. So it's kind of complicated from that point of view. I was Googling around on the web and stuff, and our neighbors to the north, Washington DNR, have put a lot of thought into the forest health, and they have a really good forest health program, a strategic plan and everything. And they define forest health in this somewhat long definition, but I thought I'd read it just to give you a sense of what everybody thinks about forest health. They define forest health as the condition of a forest ecosystem reflecting its ability to sustain structure, function, and process, resilience to fire, insects, and other disturbant mechanisms, and adaptability to changing climate, increasing drought stress, and capacity to provide ecosystem services to meet landowner objectives and human needs. Wow, that's a healthy forest. But I think for most people, to be honest, I think a healthy forest doesn't have a lot of dead trees. Most people, when they look at a forest and if they see a lot of dead trees, they feel like that's unhealthy. But, when you think about ecosystem processes like lodgepole pine, for example, and the mountain pine beetle, mountain pine beetle rolls through most lodgepole pine stands when they reach a certain age and susceptibility, and can cause extreme amounts of mortality. 80% of the overstory might be killed by during a mountain pine beetle outbreak. But if you think about the cycle of mountain pine beetle over millennia, this has been going on for a long time, and there's a time when 80% of the overstory is dead, but this is going to change as it succeeds back through its various successional sequences. So forest health can get really bogged down in some of these kinds of discussions and definitions and that kind of thing. But in general, I think these ideas of sustainability, meeting values, and particularly when it comes to fire is where forest health has become really important. On the east side, much of the restoration efforts are to create, forests that are much more resilient to fire or resistant to fire. And that is in everybody's interests to protect the communities and properties and that kind of thing. And for timber growers that have a commercial crop on the ground, protecting that from fire completely, is really important because of the economics involved. So, forest health is really a value-laden sort of concept, but I think generally we all agree that we want healthy forests and we want to manage forests so that they are providing values, particularly from economic and wildlife perspective. I guess that's kind of a rambling definition of forest health, but that's what happens when you get to talk about forest health.
No, it sounds like it just includes so many different things, and it sounds like people can value so many different things in their forest, so they might view forest health a little bit differently than somebody else.
Right.
So we talked about how like mountain pine beetle, for example, is kind of worked its way as a component of lodgepole pine stands. So how does forest health influence kind of the development of these stands, and think about things like natural disturbance and forest succession that we kind of talked about in our last episode on how forests grow?
Yeah, so natural forest development, is influenced by insects and diseases. And we tend to think of native insects and diseases as being part of the system. And, in natural forests, they may or may not really be creating unhealthy conditions. When we begin to manage forests for economic objectives or other objectives, then some of these native insects can then become pests because they're causing growth losses or mortality of crop trees. And it can be, that's where we really get into conflict with our native insects and diseases. But So managing forests to minimize losses to our native forest insects and diseases is often an objective of forest managers that are trying to, grow commercial crops. In the, more ecosystem management's point of view, tolerating a little bit more of this, having more cull in the forest, basically heart rot, top rot, and these kind of things that are really important to wildlife, but would reduce the value of the log, ends up being sort of a cost benefit analysis kind of thing. But as forests develop, there's lots of differences in this in terms of the west side versus the east side is sort of the common sort of contrast that we make in Oregon, where our dry forests tend to be much more, we tend to have more big time disturbance agents on our west side than we do on our east side, on the east side than we do on the west side. With bark beetles, mountain pine beetle, western pine beetle, fern graver, Doug fir beetle on the east side can be dramatic, particularly the mountain pine beetle, versus, and some of the defoliators like western spruce bloodworm and tussock moth can be really dramatic on the east side. Whereas on the west side, we tend to have more localized kind of outbreaks of beetles. We tend not to get the huge amount of mortality that might be caused on the east side. We tend not to have really big defoliation events on the west side. And things like Swiss needle cast along the coast is really important. The thing that really strikes me about, there's a contrast in my mind between these native insects and diseases versus invasives. And invasives, I think, really strongly influence forest health in my mind. And that's my bias and that's my value, to be honest. But sudden oak death has a toehold in Oregon, down in Southwest Oregon. It's killing tan oak and affecting other species in the forest. It's affecting the export of logs from some of our coastal docks. We have Port-Orford cedar root disease, another non-native invasive that has invaded the Port-Orford cedar native range of Port-Orford cedar and is killing trees along riparian areas and upland areas. Swiss needle cast is actually a native caused by native fungus. And that's an interesting situation where the Douglas fir plantations in the coastal strip have really seen an uptick in Swiss needle cast. And that seems to be sort of a perfect storm kind of thing where young plantations are planted in these really productive areas, and Swiss needle and the climate for the disease, particularly warm winter temperatures and warm mild temperatures, and then leaf wetness during May, June, July, August from fog and drizzle and that kind of thing really sets up these plantations for a foliage disease epidemic like we're having. And then, so, there's a lot of contrast, though. Those kind of non-native invasives like white pine blister rust is another one. It's a major, major issue in our five needle pines, white bark pine at high elevation, western white pine at all through the state, and sugar pine down in the southern part of the state are all being dramatically hit by this non-native invasive. And so I think when we think about forest health, the threats I see and the largest impacts to forest health would be from non-native invasives, and that because they can almost remove a species from commercial viability, and it can really cause dramatic changes to our ecosystems and our forest ecosystems by removing species and that kind of thing. The one other thing I just wanted to mention is with climate change, there's some conjecture that our native insects could become, quote unquote, more invasive or more could increase their impacts to forests that would be outside the sort of range of normal activity. And so there's some concern that some of the bark beetle activity we're seeing in particular is outside the range of normality, and that might be, being affected by some of our longer, hotter growing season. Our big fear right now is drought, and drought is what sort of keeps me awake. It keeps me awake at night. I'm really worried about weather, and drought is it. It's and we're in what some people call, a 20-year. For the last 20 years, we've been unusually dry, and this is starting to influence forest health and tree mortality all through the state. We're seeing it all through the Douglas fir forests on the I-5 corridor. Have been really taking a hit from what we think is drought-mediated effects, and then on the east side, we're seeing it all through the forests on the east side, and then at higher elevations in the Cascades, our snowpack issues really influence the health of the montane true fir forests like silver fir, noble fir, and they can be really influenced by drought. So drought is, and these increasing drought is something that's really worrisome to me. And I'm hoping that it starts raining or continues to rain all winter.
So you kind of talked about how some of the native pests, they can be an important component of some of the natural progression of some of these stands, and how there's a healthy amount of forest health concerns, whether it's an insect or a disease, all the way to some of the invasive species and how detrimental they can be to some of these areas, particularly like sudden oak death. My next question here is, when do some of these, whether it's a disease or a pest, when do they start to get on the radar, and when do they start to become an actual, a concern, like when they first show up, or when they start to be causing, widespread mortality? What can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a little bit variable because there might be a history around some of these invasives where they're already on the radar screen. So one of them that we're on the lookout for right now is the emerald ash borer. And the emerald ash borer is considered, it only emerged in around 2000 back east, but it's over the last 20 years, it's become the most expensive invasive species to invade North America on record. So that puts it in a sort of in a class all of its own. And it's really been removing ash from most of the forests back east. It's several different species of ash. We have Oregon ash in our forests here, particularly in the Willamette Valley and along the, to the south. And we are really fearful that insect's going to come. So we already know that one's on our radar screen. We're trying to protect our forests. We have early detection set up. We have plans in place that when it arrives, what we're going to do. Whereas some of these other ones sort of sneak in and surprise you, and then we don't really understand, what was going on. Like sudden oak death, for example, when it emerged in California, they were clueless about what it was. They had no idea. It didn't even have a scientific name yet, the causal agent with this Phytophthora remora. And it took them, 5-10 years to really get a handle on what it was. And so that was a completely different situation in that sense, where we had this non-native that nobody knew what was going on, and it was just this unusual mortality. And that really, so that got on the screen really quickly. So it really depends on, whether it's a known that we're sort of ready for or not ready for, but it's on our watch list versus some of these ones that arrive and nobody knows what's happening. There's a new shot-hole borer. It's an ambrosia beetle that's associated with oak mortality that's emerging in California, and we're really worried about that one. And but it took them a while to figure out what was going on with that one down in California. But they've described it now, and we have this scenario we're watching, but we're hoping it doesn't, make its way to Oregon. So Oregon's doing, other than white pine blister rust and sudden oak death and Port Orford cedar root disease, those are some of our major invasives. We also have some on the coast. The spruce aphid is another non-native insect that is affecting our Sitka spruce forests along the coast. But to sort of circle back to your question, in general, when we start thinking about forest health, we tend to think about the rate of mortality within a forest stand. And we get this data from permanent plots. So Forest Inventory and Analysis, the U.S. Forest Service program, has this grid of plots all across Oregon, Washington, all across the USA, including Alaska and Hawaii. And they monitor tree growth and mortality and productivity, and it gives them some really good insight into forest health. But what we think about is the annualized rate of mortality, or what percent of the forest is dying each year. So typical forests, that we think are healthy have a rate of mortality under about, 3 to 5%. Typically, an old growth forest might only have less than 1% mortality a year. A young, forest that is in a competitive exclusion phase where, it's self-thinning, the rate of mortality might be up to 3 to 4% in a stand like that. But eventually, when it gets to be 150 years old, the rate of mortality might drop down to, under 2%. So we have plot networks that support FIA, and those plots are measured, every 5 years or so. So we can, after about 10 years, we can develop, we can get a sense of what the rates of mortality are. So when, one of our general ideas is when we see the rates of mortality, starting to go over 5% or so, we really start to get a little worried about what's happening. And that gives us another way to sort of get a perspective on, our forest, are our forests healthy or not, this rate of mortality idea. And that seems to be, it's pretty objective in that sense, in the sense that, it's not really, there's no values there. It's just the facts kind of thing.
In Oregon, we fly aerial surveys too, right? To kind of map some of the different mortality events, to try to identify like disease centers and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. And you brought up a really important monitoring. So, our forest health programs in Oregon are supported by the Oregon Department of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service, their Forest Health Protection Group. And they both have really great people, really good programs going on. And each year they fly the aerial survey. And the aerial survey, basically what they're doing is they take an airplane and they have observers sitting in the airplane, typically 2 observers with sketch maps, and they're geolocated and everything. And they fly over the state and they draw polygons around mortality patches and defoliation patches. And so we get a quantitative idea of acreage of forests that are being either defoliated, or where we're seeing mountain pine beetle activity, or various other activities that are visible from a plane. Some of the diseases and that kind of thing are very difficult to observe from the plane. So mostly what we see from the plane is insect damage, but it's really, we see tree mortality, and they try to estimate the number of trees, and they draw the acreage around the trees. And that monitoring program is really fundamental to our understanding of forest health in the West, or actually throughout the whole country, but particularly in Oregon, Washington, California, Idaho, Montana. We really get a good sense of what's going on in the state from this monitoring program, and it's really critical. Of course, COVID has, influence that. And last year they weren't able to do their aerial detection survey. So we have a gap in our data, and it's looking like this year may be iffy also. We use the aerial detection survey is also really important for Swiss needlecast. And we do a spring survey for Swiss needlecast that is separate from the summer statewide survey where they fly every acre of the forest, every acre of forested area in Oregon. But the Swiss needlecast survey we do in spring, and we fly the coastal forests and we estimate symptomatic trees. So for example, the last survey we were able to pull off was in 2018, and we had about 420,000 acres of Douglas fir plantations or Douglas fir forests that were showing visible symptoms of Swiss needlecast, for example. And so that gives us a really good estimate of where the disease is an issue and on what scale it's really an issue. So those are really important monitoring programs that help with forest health assessment.
Yeah, I really enjoy seeing some of the results from those surveys and how it changes from year to year. The group that you mentioned, the Oregon Department of Forestry and the Forest Health Group at the Forest Service there, they actually publish a forest health report every year too, and I always look forward to kind of reading through that to seeing.
Yeah, that's a really good document. It's called Forest Health Highlights is the name of the document. They do it for each state. Well, they do it in Region 6, which is Oregon and Washington. They do it for Washington and Oregon, and we have an annual document that comes out called Forest Health Highlights. And it's really one of the most important documents in my mind that really is an assessment of the statewide conditions and I think that is really relevant to forest managers because it's regionally based. And they publish these maps online so that you can go online and look at your property and see whether they've been surveying, foliage diseases or defoliators or mountain pine beetle outbreaks and picking up, mortality. More recently, they've been dealing with the drought associated mortality, and it's very difficult for them to assess the cause of those dead trees. So a lot of times they're having to map it as unexplained tree mortality or hypothesized drought mortality and that kind of thing. But we've been seeing more and more of that show up on the Doug fir along that I-5 corridor.
Yeah, what I'll do is I will make sure and I will get those links to those that Forest Health Highlights and to that website, and I will put that on our class resources.
Yeah, great.
Or podcast resources on our website. So we work here in Oregon, and I know you mentioned a lot of different pests and diseases already, but if you could pick 3 of the most influential in Oregon currently, which 3 would you pick? And it could be anything from abiotic, biotic, a pest, an insect, a disease.
Oh, wow. That's a tough one. So well, we haven't talked much about fire, but as we know, fire can be very destructive, particularly to commercial forest plantations, where once, they can cause really a lot of economic hardship for commercial forest plantations. So I have to think of fire, now we all know fire is a natural, fire occurs naturally, but it's really complicated nowadays because of our drought, our long-term intensive drought, weather conditions that might accentuate fire, and then where the fire is burning and what started the fire, whether it's human caused or whether it's, lightning caused and that kind of thing. So fire, is a major forest health concern, particularly from the, people who are investing in their forests or are living in the forest, to protect human well-being, communities, and that kind of thing. Fire is probably on the radar as one of the most important forest health issues. I'm not a fire ecologist. I'm, a biologist, and so my focus tends to be on the biota that's influenced from forests. But fire is really key. I'd say drought is the other one that really is influencing our forest right now. And we've seen in California, they had an epic drought. They called it 100,000-year drought kind of thing. Anyway, we saw incredible amounts of tree mortality along the western slope of the Sierra Nevada associated with this drought. It was an unprecedented mortality event after a 4-year drought that was extreme. So that drought is one of the biggest threats, I think, to forests right now. And then sort of, to lump all the invasives together, I would say invasives are the other, really key threat to forest health right now. When we compare ourselves to like New York State or something, we don't have a lot of invasives compared to them. But our invasives are slowly accumulating, and we're really getting worried about what the potential for invasives are in Oregon. I think if I was to pick, if you don't mind if I keep on with that, if I was to pick some native insects and diseases, of course it's Swiss needlecast foliage disease in Western Oregon, and bark beetles and defoliators in Eastern Oregon are probably the biggest forest health threats to, landowners. And but the drought thing has really been complicated because people are having these trees die, and they don't know what to do with them. They want to fell them for hazard purposes, but they can't, sell them. There's a glut on the firewood market and that kind of thing.
Kind of on that last note that you mentioned there. So, say I own a woodland, right? And maybe I have some mortality, or I'm kind of concerned about a forest health issue. What are some things that I could do to kind of try and identify whether it's, an insect, a disease, or drought? Is there something I can do, or is there someone I can call and talk to about that?
Well, it's complicated depending on what your goals are. I think the OSU Forestry Extension and our Master Woodland Manager program is probably one of the front lines in terms of the potential to get an evaluation of your property. Then I think the Oregon Department of Foresters, stewardship foresters also tend to be really locally savvy and know what's causing local tree mortality. And then in terms of resources and that kind of thing, there's the Oregon Department of Forestry has a really great website, and the Forest Health Protection of the U.S. Forest Service has their Region 6 group has a really good website also for sort of more in-depth information. And plus they summarize the aerial detection surveys and what are the current, issues that people are seeing. I think in terms of just one of the things is really to walk your property and get a real sense of how extensive the mortality really is. Is it just one pocket of trees? Is it scattered throughout your property? Does it seem associated with a certain habitat type, a ridge top or a low elevation or a roadside, and getting a sense of just your property is really something that is really important. Another option for having, assessing what's actually happening on your property, depending on the severity and your concerns and where your goals are, whether it's a commercial goal or a biodiversity goal, would be to have a professional forester come visit your property and walk the property with you. They tend to really be savvy about what the local issues are in terms of tree mortality. They can identify root rot and bark beetles and that kind of thing. The other groups, depending on how much property you have or whether you just have a few individual trees near your house, then you probably want to consider an arborist. And arborists are usually very savvy about what's affecting trees. But if the trees are on property where they could be a hazard, it's really important to get an arborist to evaluate the hazard potential to your house or to your property, where you're parking your car and these kind of things. That can be really important. So depending on the scale of the mortality and what you want, what you want to learn about the mortality, oftentimes if you connect with our extension foresters or myself, the forest health specialist, you can send photographs and send a series of photographs with your question. Typically, it's really nice to get a close-up of the tree so that we can identify what kind of tree it is. Foliage and bark or whatever is really important, and then a sort of a landscape setting type photo or a context type photo, and then close-ups of what you think the damage is, whether it's down, at the bole of the tree or whether it's up higher. If you can get a series of photographs, often are really helpful in assessing, via email or whatever, what might be going on. So that can really assist. And we also have an Ask an Expert program. And that's an online program through, Nationwide Extension Service. And you can get some pretty good information from there too. But the OSU Extension Service has experts across all these fields, and we have entomologists and pathologists at the Oregon State University who participate in Ask an Expert and who will also answer questions. In those cases, it's really rare to get those people to come visit your property. So that's where having photographs and explanations and that kind of thing. And we also, depending on whether you're really curious about what's causing the disease or insect or whatever, we do have the OSU Plant Clinic has a program where you can send samples. It's really common for people in agriculture to send samples to these labs. And they can identify insects and they can do analysis on forest diseases. However, there is a cost with the forest disease evaluation, but I think we can get insect identification for free through that program.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Ask an Expert too. I think given the current pandemic, that's another really, really great resource, and especially emailing pictures too.
Yeah, pictures
really useful. Especially before I even, if I am going out to visit a site or something like that, having a picture first can give me a kind of a lead that I can do, a little bit of research before I actually, or ask,
right.
Folks like you who know a lot more about forest health issues than I do. So.
Yeah, there's some really good field guides and that kind of thing to identification of insects and diseases, but it takes a little bit of training. So they're not necessarily super helpful to just anybody to get one of these books. However, with a little bit of, training, which you can sometimes get through our extension programs, it can give you a lot of, you can start to try to identify some of these yourself. There's a lot of resources on the web. It's incredible how many resources are out there in terms of field guides and identification guides and management guides. And we have some excellent management guides, in the OSU Extension Publications has a really good series of publications on forest health and managing forest health and managing, fire resilience and these kind of things in our OSU Extension catalog.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess, is there anything else that you'd like to tell us, Dave, about forest health? I can't think we really kind of dove into a lot here, but
we've jumped
thoughts you have.
We've jumped around a lot. I mean, I guess with climate change and drought and invasives, and there's a lot to be depressed about. And but I remain reasonably hopeful that our forests are resilient. There are forest health issues, particularly, on some of our east side forests where fire suppression has led to overstock stands, and we have, a lot of changes in the structure and composition of the forest that makes them less resilient. But restoration forestry is all about restoring sustainability and resilience and resistance to some of these stands. So there are models for maintaining forest health, and I don't think it's really anything, it's possible in 50 years I might not say the same thing, but right now I think we do have a lot to be, happy about in terms of our forests, and we're seeing some issues, of course, and we've gone into those, but I think we're still doing pretty well, in Oregon with forest health. We've numerous issues, but in general, I think we're not as bad as other places around the globe. So from that perspective, I think, Oregon is actually, in a reasonably good place.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dave. I know we kind of bounce around a lot of different topics, but ultimately, I think we really barely scratched the surface on some of the different stuff we can talk about when it comes to forest health. So if you're listening and you have a question about a forest health topic that maybe we didn't cover today, please drop us a comment or send us a message on our website at blogs.oregonstate.edu/inthewoodspodcast. Dave, maybe we can talk you into joining us again to talk a little bit more about something like Swiss needlecast or mountain pine beetle. Now, as we start to wrap up here, we have what we call our lightning round, where we kind of ask each of our guests a series of questions. So the first one here is, what is your favorite tree?
That's a tough one for me, but I don't want to be too cheesy, but Douglas fir. Douglas fir is my favorite tree. It's just a phenomenal tree. It's the best 2x4 in the world. But sort of that, this is a tree that can grow to 1,000 years, can reach 300 feet high. It's just, when I'm in the forest and I, particularly with old growth Douglas fir, there's 10 or 15 of these trees per acre. I'm just so wowed by them. I just love Douglas fir, and plus it's just, it's our number one commercial crop on the west side, and it's just a phenomenal tree, an amazing tree to me.
Yeah, it's hard to be in Oregon and not really appreciate the Douglas fir. All right, so the second question I have here is, what is the most interesting thing that you bring with you in the field, whether in your cruiser vest or other field kit?
Well, I guess I never want to be in the field without my hand lens, and this is a magnifying lens where, some of my friends and I call it the world of 10x or the world of 20x, where you just can't see things at that scale, and having a hand lens really helps you see the things you're that are difficult to see with the naked eye, and it really brings things into perspective. So my sort of unique tool might be a magnifying lens, a hand lens.
No, I think that's a good one. And lastly, what resources would you recommend to our listeners? I know we kind of covered that a little bit, some of the resources that OSU Extension has, and then some of the resources that the Forest Health Program has at the Forest Service. But is there anything else you could think of, just kind of as we're starting to close out here?
Yeah, well, there's, the web has really good resources, our state resources, and our adjoining states, California, California Extension, Washington DNR, Idaho, their state forestry group, Montana, their state forestry group, and the federal offices there. So actually, there's a lot of resources available to sort of delve into forest health. And depending on, what your level of interest is and what you're trying to find out, there's, my two go-to websites are probably the Oregon Department of Forestry Forest Health group and our Healthy Forest group, and then the U.S. Forest Service Forest Health Protection website. Those are my two, go-to things. And then for us, I think locally, the Oregon State Extension catalog that has all the information. And then there's also the Oregon Forest, OFRI, Oregon Forest Resources Institute, also has a lot of online information about forest health. And I think they're a really good go-to group also. So, just Googling around the web is a great way to find information. Sometimes it can take you down a rat hole, but there's really good information out there.
Well, thanks again, Dave. And thank you all for listening to this month's episode of In the Woods podcast.
Thanks so much for listening. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on our website, blogs.oregonstate.edu/inthewoods-podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Visit the Tell Us What You Think tab on our website to leave us a comment, suggest a guest or topic, or ask a question that can be featured in a future episode. And also give us your feedback by filling out our survey. In the Woods is produced by Lauren Grand, Carrie Berger, Jacob Putney, Stephen Fitzgerald, and Jason O'Brien, who are all members of the Oregon State University Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Team. This podcast is made possible by funding from the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. Music for In the Woods podcast was composed by Jeffrey Hino, and graphic design was created by Christina Freehoff. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we can't wait to talk to you again next month. Until then, what's in your woods?